No one expects their life to shift in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday evening, but that was the moment Margaret Lawson felt the ground move beneath her. The kitchen clock ticked steadily above the stove, the sound sharp in the quiet house, and the smell of reheated soup filled the air as she sat at the worn wooden table Daniel had bought 28 years ago when they were newly married and full of plans. The house in Portland had once been loud with laughter, slammed doors, late-night talks, and the soft rhythm of family life, but now it felt too big, too still, like it was holding its breath. Margaret traced the rim of her coffee mug, now cold, and stared at the neat stack of bills in front of her, each envelope a quiet reminder that the world did not pause for grief. Across from her sat her son, Ethan, tall and broad-shouldered at 24, his dark hair slightly messy from the rain outside, his expression thoughtful in a way that reminded her so much of his father that it made her chest ache. He had driven down from Seattle that afternoon without telling her why, saying only that he wanted to check in, and she knew her son well enough to sense that something important sat behind his calm eyes. She tried to lighten the mood, asking about work, about the tech project he had mentioned last week, about whether he was eating properly, but he answered gently and briefly, his attention fixed on her instead. Finally, he folded his hands on the table, leaned forward, and said her name in a tone that made her heart tighten. "Mom," he began, steady but careful, "we need to talk about the house." The words hung between them, heavy and unavoidable. Margaret forced a small smile, brushing back a strand of her shoulder-length brown hair that now carried more silver than she liked to admit. "The house is fine," she replied quickly, almost defensively. "It just needs a little work." Ethan's gaze softened. "It needs a new roof. The plumbing in the basement is leaking again. And you shouldn't be climbing ladders to fix gutters." She opened her mouth to argue, but he gently slid a folded brochure across the table instead. The glossy paper felt strange in her hand, too bright against the worn wood. On the front was a photo of a peaceful lakeside community in Vancouver, small cottages with wide windows and flower boxes, walking paths lined with trees, and sunlight reflecting off calm water. It looked like something from a dream, not her life. "I've been researching places," Ethan said, speaking faster now as if he had rehearsed this speech. "Communities that are safe, smaller, easier to manage. This one has art studios, Mom. Real studios. Classes every week. You always said you wanted to paint again." The word paint stirred something buried deep inside her. Before Daniel got sick, before hospital visits and long nights and whispered prayers, she had spent hours in the spare bedroom with her easel, losing herself in color and light. After he passed, she had closed that door and never opened it again. It felt wrong to create beauty when her world felt broken. "I'm not moving to Canada," she said quickly, her voice thinner than she intended. "This is my home. Your father built that porch with his own hands." Ethan nodded. "I know. I remember holding the nails while he worked. I remember the barbecue the day it was finished. But, Mom, this house is full of memories that make you sad. Every time I visit, you look smaller somehow, like you're carrying the walls on your back." His words were not cruel, just honest, and that honesty made her eyes sting. She looked around the kitchen, the faded curtains she had sewn herself, the dent in the refrigerator door from when Ethan crashed his bike indoors as a kid, the crack in the tile Daniel had always promised to fix. These were not just objects, they were pieces of her life. Letting go felt like betrayal. "If I leave," she whispered, "it's like I'm leaving him." Ethan's expression changed, deepened, and he reached across the table to take her hand. "You're not leaving Dad. You're leaving a house. He loved you more than these walls ever could. And he wouldn't want you stuck here just because you're afraid to move forward." The word "stuck" hit her harder than she expected. She had not realized how visible her sadness had become, how transparent her routine was: wake up, make coffee, water the plants Daniel once cared for, avoid the spare bedroom, watch television until sleep finally came. She had told herself she was coping, that this was what healing looked like, but hearing her son speak made her question everything. Ethan took a slow breath. I can help you sell it. I've already talked to a realtor friend. The market's good right now. You could downsize, have money left over, live somewhere beautiful. Somewhere that feels new. She flipped open the brochure again, her eyes lingering on a photo of a small studio with tall windows overlooking the lake. Sunlight spilled across an empty canvas on an easel. For a moment, she imagined herself there, brush in hand, the air filled with the scent of paint instead of old wood and dust. The image both scared and thrilled her. You've thought about this a lot, she said quietly. Ethan gave a small, almost nervous laugh. 4 months. I didn't know how to bring it up without hurting you. You think this won't hurt? She asked, though her tone had softened. It might, he admitted. But staying here is hurting you more. Silence settled between them again, but it felt different now, less suffocating. Margaret studied her son's face, noticing the determination there, the love behind it. He wasn't trying to erase the past, he was trying to protect her future. She realized that while she had been busy holding on to memories, Ethan had been quietly watching her fade. The thought alone made her chest tighten with both guilt and gratitude. She stood slowly and walked to the window above the sink, looking out at the backyard where Daniel had planted a maple tree the year Ethan was born. Its leaves were beginning to turn, bright orange against the gray sky. Seasons changed whether she wanted them to or not. If I did this, she said without turning around, you'd help me? Every step, Ethan replied instantly. I promise. She closed her eyes for a second, feeling the weight of the years behind her and the uncertainty ahead. Selling the house meant packing away photos, choosing what to keep and what to give away, saying goodbye to neighbors who had known her for decades. It meant stepping into a place where no one knew her story, where she would not be Daniel's widow, but simply Margaret. The idea frightened her, but beneath the fear was something else, something lighter, almost hopeful. She turned back to the table, walked slowly toward her son, and picked up the brochure once more. Her fingers no longer trembled. I'm not promising anything, she said carefully, meeting his eyes. But, maybe we can call the realtor. Just to talk. Ethan's face broke into a smile so wide and relieved that it nearly made her cry. In that instant, she understood that this was not just about property or money or practicality. It was about choosing life again. And as they sat there together at the kitchen table, the air still heavy with memories but now touched by possibility, Margaret felt the first small crack in the wall she had built around her heart, a quiet opening where light could slip through, and she had no idea yet how much that simple, surprising offer would change everything. The morning Margaret Lawson arrived in Vancouver, the air felt different, crisp and alive, carrying the scent of pine and fresh water instead of the damp weight of old memories, and as she stepped out of the taxi in front of her small lakeside cottage, she felt both brave and fragile at the same time. The house was simple with pale blue siding, wide windows, and a narrow porch that faced the water, nothing like the large family home she had left behind in Portland, yet it held a quiet promise that made her heart beat faster, and while Ethan carried in her suitcases with steady determination, she stood still for a moment, staring at the calm lake that stretched like glass under the early autumn sun, wondering if she had just made the boldest decision of her life or the most foolish one, because selling the old house had not been easy. Every packed box had felt like sealing away a piece of her marriage, every empty room had echoed with memories of laughter and long conversations with Daniel, but she had signed the papers anyway, watched strangers walk through the doorway that once belonged only to her family, and driven away without looking back, holding on to Ethan's quiet reassurance that this was not an ending but a beginning. The first few nights in the cottage were restless. She woke up disoriented, reaching for light switches that were not there, listening for sounds that did not exist, and the silence pressed against her like a question she did not know how to answer. Yet each morning the sunlight poured through the tall windows and painted the wooden floors in gold, and slowly she began to breathe easier, arranging her books on the shelves, hanging framed photos on fresh white walls, placing Daniel's old coffee mug near the stove not as a symbol of loss but as a memory she could carry gently. And when Ethan left to return to Seattle, hugging her longer than usual before getting into his car, she felt a small wave of fear rise inside her chest, but she refused to let it drown her. On her third day alone, she noticed a flyer pinned near the mailbox announcing open studio hours at the Community Arts Center just down the path by the lake, and she stood there for several minutes staring at the word welcome, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper, because painting had once been her escape, her joy, the way she made sense of the world. But after Daniel passed, she had closed that chapter as if color itself had betrayed her, and now the thought of stepping back into that world felt both thrilling and terrifying. Yet something inside her whispered that she had not moved across a border just to sit in another quiet room, so she put on a light sweater, tied her hair back, and walked down the tree-lined path toward the studio, her heart beating faster with every step. The building was warm and bright, filled with the soft hum of conversation and the faint scent of acrylic paint, canvases leaning against walls, sunlight streaming through large windows that faced the lake, and for a second she almost turned around, convinced she did not belong there anymore. But before she could retreat, a calm voice beside her said, "First time here," and she turned to see a tall man with kind gray eyes and silver-streaked hair standing near an easel, holding a paintbrush like it was an old friend. "Yes," she replied, feeling suddenly shy, "I just moved here." And he nodded with a small smile that felt genuine rather than polite. "Welcome, I'm Thomas," he said simply, not asking the questions she feared about why she moved or what she left behind, just offering his name like an open door. And when she introduced herself, he handed her a clean brush without hesitation and pointed toward an empty easel near the window. "The light changes fast in the afternoon," he said. "If you want to catch it, don't wait too long." And there was something in the way he said it that sounded less like advice about painting and more like advice about life. Margaret stood in front of the blank canvas, her hands trembling slightly as she squeezed paint onto the palette, the bright colors almost shocking after years of beige walls and muted routines. And when she finally lifted the brush and made the first stroke, something inside her shifted, a small release of tension she had carried for too long, and she focused on the lake outside, the way the water reflected the sky, the gentle curve of the distant hills, letting herself get lost in movement rather than memory. And every now and then she felt Thomas's quiet presence nearby, not hovering, not watching too closely, just existing in this same peaceful rhythm. And when she stepped back to look at her unfinished painting, she felt a spark of pride she had not felt in years. Over the next few weeks, she returned to the studio again and again, sometimes early in the morning when the mist hovered over the water, sometimes in the late afternoon when the sky turned soft shades of pink and gold, and each visit felt easier than the last, the other artists greeting her warmly, the conversations light and kind, and Thomas often worked near her, occasionally offering gentle suggestions or asking about her favorite artists. And she learned that he too had moved to the lakeside community after losing his wife several years earlier, that he had once worked as a high school teacher before retiring, that he preferred quiet evenings and strong coffee, and their shared understanding of grief created a quiet bond between them, one built not on dramatic words but on steady presence. One evening after a long painting session, they walked along the dock as the sun dipped low, the sky glowing in deep orange, and Thomas spoke about how he once thought his life had ended with his wife's passing, how he had felt guilty for laughing again, for enjoying small things, but how he eventually realized that honoring love did not mean freezing time. And Margaret listened carefully, her heart tightening because she recognized those same feelings inside herself, the fear that happiness would somehow erase what came before, and when he glanced at her and said softly, "You seem lighter lately," she felt a warmth spread through her chest, not because he was flirting or pushing boundaries, but because he had noticed her change, the way her shoulders no longer slumped, the way her smile reached her eyes again. Back at her cottage that night, she stood by the window looking out at the lake, thinking about the kitchen table in Portland where Ethan had first suggested this move, remembering how trapped she had felt in a house filled with echoes, and she realized that her son had not just given her a new address, he had given her space to breathe, to rediscover parts of herself she thought were gone, and when her phone buzzed with a message from him asking, "How's the new adventure?" she smiled and replied, "Better than I expected," because for the first time in years, the quiet around her did not feel empty, it felt full of possibility, and as she set her phone down and glanced at the half-finished painting resting against the wall, she understood that this new beginning was not about replacing the past but expanding her world, adding new color beside old memories, and somewhere between the lake's reflection and the steady kindness of a man who understood her silence, Margaret Lawson felt herself stepping forward, not rushed, not pressured, but gently moving toward a life that no longer felt stuck, a life that was slowly, beautifully becoming her own again. By the time autumn settled over the lakeside community, Margaret Lawson could no longer pretend that her feelings for Thomas Reed were simple friendship, because every time he walked into the studio her heart reacted before her mind could reason with it, and the warmth she felt around him was no longer just comfort but something deeper, something alive. Yet with that warmth came a quiet fear that followed her home each night and sat beside her like a shadow. She had grown used to their routine, painting side by side, sharing coffee on the bench outside, talking about books, about travel dreams they once had, about small daily things that somehow felt meaningful, and Thomas never rushed her, never crossed a line, he simply stayed present, steady and kind. And that steadiness both calmed and unsettled her because it made her imagine a future she had once believed was closed forever. One chilly evening he invited her to dinner at his cottage, nothing formal, just grilled salmon and fresh bread, and she stood in front of her closet longer than she cared to admit, finally choosing a soft cream sweater that made her feel both comfortable and quietly hopeful. Her hand slightly unsteady as she brushed her hair and looked at her reflection, wondering when she had started caring again about how someone saw her. His cottage was warm with soft music playing low in the background, candles flickering gently on the table, and the scent of lemon and herbs filling the air, and when he opened the door his smile held a hint of nervousness that mirrored her own, which somehow made it easier to step inside. And throughout dinner they talked easily, laughing about a painting mishap earlier that week, discussing a local art show, but beneath the light conversation there was an unspoken tension building, a question neither had yet voiced. After they finished eating, they moved to sit near the fireplace, the flames casting golden light across the room, and for a few quiet minutes they simply listened to the soft crackle of wood, until Thomas turned toward her with a seriousness she had sensed was coming, and said gently, "Margaret, I don't want to assume anything, and I don't want to rush you, but I care about you more than I expected to." His voice steady yet vulnerable, and the honesty in his eyes made her breath catch because she felt the same, yet admitting it felt like stepping off a cliff. She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers together as memories of Daniel rose up. Uninvited, the hospital room, the last time he squeezed her hand, the promises she whispered through tears, and a wave of guilt washed over her, as if opening her heart again meant erasing the love that came before, and she shook her head slightly, not in rejection of Thomas but in confusion of her own emotions. "I'm afraid," she confessed softly, the words barely above a whisper, and he nodded, not surprised. "So am I," he replied. "Losing someone changes you, but it doesn't mean your story ends there," and his calm acceptance of her fear made her chest tighten with both relief and sadness. That night she returned to her cottage unable to sleep, pacing slowly between the kitchen and the living room, the lake outside reflecting the moonlight in silent waves, and she sat at the edge of her bed thinking about the years after Daniel's passing, how she had built walls to survive, convincing herself that loyalty meant staying alone, that loving again would somehow diminish what she had shared, yet deep down she knew love was not a limited resource. It did not shrink when shared, it expanded, but her heart still needed reassurance, and as she lay back staring at the ceiling she whispered into the quiet darkness, asking for a sign, asking for peace, not expecting an answer yet hoping for clarity. The next morning her phone rang earlier than usual, and seeing Ethan's name on the screen brought a smile to her face, his voice bright with excitement as he shared news about a woman he had recently met named Olivia, how she loved books and volunteered at a community center, how he felt different around her in a good way, and Margaret listened carefully, hearing the same hope in his tone that she had felt in herself, and when he paused and said gently, "Mom, I think Dad would want both of us to keep living fully," the words settled deep inside her because they echoed the quiet truth she had been avoiding, and she realized that her son was not moving on from his father's memory. He was carrying it forward while still making space for new joy. After the call ended, she walked down to the lake, the cool air brushing against her cheeks, and watched the sunlight dance across the water, thinking about Thomas's patience, about how he never tried to compete with the past, never asked her to forget, only offered companionship in the present, and slowly the guilt that had gripped her began to loosen, replaced by a softer understanding that honoring Daniel did not require freezing her heart in time, that she could cherish what she had and still accept what was being offered. Later that afternoon at the studio, Thomas greeted her with his usual warm smile, but there was caution in his eyes as if he was giving her space to decide, and instead of avoiding the conversation, she stepped closer and said quietly, "I'd been thinking about what you said," her voice steady despite the nerves in her chest, "and I care about you too." And the relief that crossed his face was gentle rather than triumphant, because this was not about winning but about mutual courage, and they stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, just two people choosing to move forward with honesty. As the days passed, their connection deepened naturally, small walks turning into longer talks, shared meals becoming a regular rhythm. And though Margaret still had moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly, they no longer paralyzed her. Instead they coexisted with new experiences, like two chapters in the same book. And one evening as she sat alone at her kitchen table reflecting on the path that had brought her here, from the heavy silence of her old home to this lakeside community filled with color and possibility, she understood that fear had not disappeared entirely, but it no longer controlled her. Because love after loss was not betrayal, it was bravery, and as she prepared to see Thomas the next day, feeling both calm and quietly excited, she realized that the greatest risk was not loving again, but refusing to let herself feel at all, and for the first time in years, Margaret Lawson chose courage over fear, opening her heart to a future that felt uncertain yet beautifully alive. The evening Margaret invited Thomas over for dinner felt different from the start, as if the air itself carried a quiet promise, and she moved around her small lakeside kitchen with a mix of nerves and excitement she had not felt in years, checking the oven twice, adjusting the flowers on the table, smoothing her soft blue sweater as though preparing for something more than just a meal, because in many ways this was the first time she was welcoming love into her home instead of grief. The cottage glowed warmly under the golden light of sunset, the lake outside reflecting soft shades of pink and orange, and when the doorbell rang her heart jumped in a way that made her laugh at herself. Yet when she opened the door and saw Thomas standing there holding a simple bouquet of wildflowers, his smile gentle and slightly shy, all her nervous thoughts quieted, replaced by a calm happiness that felt steady rather than overwhelming. Dinner was easy and natural, filled with light conversation about the art show coming up next month, about a new cafe opening in town, about how the maple trees near the dock were turning bright red, and Margaret noticed how comfortable she felt across from him, how she no longer measured every word or questioned every feeling, because something between them had settled into trust. And just as she began to think the night could not feel more complete, there was a sudden knock at the door that made her pause mid-sentence, confusion flickering across her face since she was not expecting anyone else. She excused herself and walked to the door, her mind racing through possibilities, and when she opened it her breath caught in her throat because standing there was Ethan, smiling wide despite the long drive, and beside him stood a young woman with warm brown eyes and a friendly expression, holding a small overnight bag in one hand, and for a moment Margaret could only stare before Ethan laughed softly and said, "Surprise, Mom," stepping forward to wrap his arms around her, the familiar comfort of his embrace grounding her instantly. She pulled back slightly, still stunned but smiling, and he introduced the young woman as Olivia, the same Olivia he had spoken about on the phone, and Margaret quickly invited them inside, apologizing for the unexpected state of things though the cottage looked perfectly fine, and when Thomas rose from the table to greet them politely, the room shifted from intimate to lively in seconds, the quiet dinner transforming into a warm gathering filled with new energy. Introductions flowed smoothly, Thomas shaking Ethan's hand with genuine respect, Olivia complimenting Margaret's artwork displayed on the walls, and soon they were all seated together, sharing food and stories as though this meeting had been planned all along, and Margaret watched her son closely, noticing how easily he spoke about his job, how naturally he reached for Olivia's hand when she laughed, and she felt a swell of pride mixed with relief because she could see that he too was building something meaningful in his life. As the evening continued, conversation moved from travel dreams to childhood memories, Ethan recalling how he once tried to help his father fix the porch and ended up hammering his own shoelace to a board, causing the table to erupt in laughter, and even Thomas shared stories from his years teaching high school, his voice animated and warm, and Margaret realized that for the first time in a long while, her home sounded full again, not with noise that overwhelmed but with connection that nourished. Later, as Olivia offered to help wash dishes and Thomas stepped outside briefly to take a call, Ethan stayed behind in the kitchen with his mother, drying plates beside her in a quiet moment that felt both ordinary and deeply meaningful, and he glanced at her carefully before speaking in a softer tone. "I wanted to see it for myself," he admitted, and Margaret looked at him curiously, asking what he meant, and he met her eyes with a steady gaze that held both love and protectiveness. "I wanted to see you happy," he said simply, and those words settled into her heart with a weight that was not heavy but profound, because she understood that his surprise visit was not about curiosity or control, it was about reassurance, about witnessing the life he had hoped she would build when he first suggested she sell the house months ago. She felt tears rise unexpectedly but blinked them back, placing a gentle hand on his arm and assuring him that she was more than okay, that she felt alive in a way she had almost forgotten was possible, and Ethan smiled in a way that mirrored the relief she had once seen on his face at their old kitchen table when she agreed to consider moving. And in that moment Margaret saw clearly how far they had both come, from fear and uncertainty to courage and growth. When everyone stepped outside onto the porch later that night, the lake shimmered under a sky full of bright stars, cool air wrapping around them as Thomas stood close beside her without pressure, his presence steady and respectful, and Olivia leaned into Ethan's shoulder while pointing out a constellation she recognized, and Margaret felt something inside her settle into place, a quiet certainty that this was not a replacement of the past but an expansion of it, that the love she had shared with Daniel still lived in her memories and stories, yet it no longer blocked her from experiencing new joy. Thomas gently reached for her hand, giving her space to pull away if she wished, but she did not hesitate this time, instead intertwining her fingers with his in a simple gesture that carried deep meaning, and she looked around at the small group gathered under the night sky, her son, who had once surprised her with a bold suggestion at the kitchen table, now standing confident and hopeful, the young woman by his side representing his own new chapter, and the kind man next to her offering companionship without erasing her history, and she felt gratitude flood through her, not just for the present moment but for the journey that led there. As the night grew later and laughter softened into comfortable conversation, Margaret realized that the true surprise had not been Ethan's sudden appearance at her door but the transformation within herself, the way she had moved from clinging to what was familiar to embracing what was possible, and when she finally closed the door after saying goodnight, leaning back against it with a quiet smile, she understood that happiness did not arrive in grand dramatic gestures but in steady choices, brave steps, and unexpected reunions that confirmed she was exactly where she needed to be. And in the stillness of her cozy cottage by the lake, Margaret Lawson felt certain that the offer her son made months ago had not taken anything away from her life. It had gently led her toward a future filled with warmth, connection, and a love story she never imagined she would have the courage to begin again.